I think I'm sure that I reflect most of you in the room, where I just felt that this was just a horrendous tragedy for these young men. When I first watched the film, I was crying and stuff. I think that what really touched me about the film, given what I do at the network, which is media relations and stuff, was the role that the media had in the I guess I would call it inhumane acts to these young men. They treated them as inhuman. They called things wilding. They called them members of a wolf pack. A wolf pack. At another point in the film that you didn't see, they called them brutes. Another point, they called them monsters. At no point did they refer to them as people who may or may not have caused something to happen. So that was my reaction to the film. I don't know, do you want to go ahead and talk about what your reaction was? Or?
Well, you can go ahead and explain
Okay.
what the network does.
Well, why don't I just to give you a brief overview of what the Vermont network does. We're the federally recognized coalition for domestic and sexual violence here in Vermont. We have 14 member programs that we represent who cover the whole state of Vermont. I left a handout in the back that shows you where each program is located. Each program works with domestic and sexual violence victims and survivors, except for in Chittenden County and Washington County, where there's two separate programs for each one of those. Basically, we support our programs, our member programs, through training and technical assistance, capacity building trainings. We advocate for public policy that supports victims and holds offenders accountable for their crimes. And we seek to change societal attitudes and beliefs through community outreach and prevention, education. That, in a nutshell, is what the network does. One example of the trainings that we do is we train SANE nurses, sexual assault nurse examiners, which are located in hospitals throughout the state, who do the examinations of sexual assault victims and take evidence and document the finding of evidence that will be used later in court cases and further activity. Another thing that we've done, and I'm sure someone else will talk about a little bit more than what I'm going to talk about it, is we were one of the backers of the Innocence Protection Act here in Vermont, which happened in 2007. And that is an act that came into law that basically says that any time a person is convicted of sexual assault or aggravated sexual assault in Vermont, they can ask for their DNA, the DNA from their case, to be retested at any point in time. We worked with the legislature to include that a victim notification be included, so that when someone asks for that test, for another retesting of the DNA, the victim of the assault is notified of that. We believe in Vermont that this has been used, but to our knowledge, no one has been exonerated by this at this point, and that's just my knowledge.
So I'll start with having watched this in its entirety. I come from a different perspective, mainly because, one, I came into this field with a true sense of the fact that we have both male and female victims of sexual violence, and that we need to provide services for both male and female victims. And we actually have the only shelter in the United States which houses male and female victims of sexual violence. So Vermont is very much on the forefront of ensuring victims regardless. So our mission at the Sexual Assault Crisis Team is that we provide services for all non-offending human beings. It doesn't matter if you are male, female, gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual. None of that stuff matters to us. Our shelter and our services are open and equal. So I watched this from the perspective of the fact that there were numerous victims whose lives will never be the same. The 5 young men's lives will never be the same. I can almost 100% guarantee you that they probably experienced sexual assaults within the jail system that they'll have to deal with and struggle with for the rest of their lives. The victim, who didn't even remember the event, not only was she a victim and her whole life was affected, but you didn't see the part where they actually brought her into court, even though she could not recall anything that happened. The prosecution brought her into court so that, the jury could see all of that go down. Her family members, the 5 young men and their family members, they're all victims. And it's a lifespan thing. It's not something that any of those people are going to recover from. So I have a lot of sort of strong feelings about that, because I do a lot of work at Norwich University, our military academy. And young men and young women come and see me. There are thousands of victims who do not dare come forward and say that something happened to them. And the process that I saw there, I have seen many, many times. A victim will go to the emergency room. The collection of evidence can take up to 5 hours. After that, they get to face the same kind of questioning that the accused faced, because it really is part of the process of them having to talk in detail about whatever happened to them, to the police. And what oftentimes people don't understand is then at that point, it's no longer up to the victim whether or not that case goes forward. The police report it to the state's attorney's office. If they investigate and decide it should move forward, they send it to the state's attorney's office. The state's attorney's office determines whether or not it will see its day in court. And in the state of Vermont, the accused rightfully has an attorney. The state's attorney represents the state of Vermont. The only party that does not have representation and is not given any representation is the victim. The victim simply becomes a witness in their own case. So I can empathize in a lot of different ways of that. In Washington County, we are your freestanding sexual violence program. So we have a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week hotline. We respond immediately to any and all victims going to the hospital. We bring them oftentimes down into our shelter. We provide one-on-one support for them. We go to the police station with them. We go through the court system with them. And oftentimes we're supporting them for years later. We see all ages, all races, all cultures, all of those folks come through our doors. And oftentimes they come through them for 20 or 30 years. So I have seen victims on my first day at the sexual assault crisis team, and now I'm on my 24th year there, and I see victims I saw on my first day who are still struggling to reclaim their lives. And so at no time could I support that process, because those young men were innocent, and I do not believe that all men are rapists. And please support by telling my husband that. I definitely do not believe that everybody is being affected, but what I do see is I see victims being silenced because they too have to go through that system, and it's not supportive of a victim of sexual violence, regardless of gender.
So I'm going to shift over into attorney mode and civil rights mode. I think the first thing, my first reaction to this was outrage and absolute horrific sadness that in 1989 in New York City, something like, it's almost exactly like the Scottsboro case down in Alabama in 1930 was happening all over again, right before our eyes. And it really was nothing but a 20th century lynching when it comes down to it. I really thought that from the very beginning that one of the things that factored into this as far as the police response to this seemed to be that here's this pack of kids running through the park, black kids, Latino kids, and these kids to the police were expendable. You know, they were just the kids that were terrorizing everyone. They didn't care whether these were good kids, bad kids. These were kids of color. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they ended up having a prison sentence for crimes that they were innocent of as a result of that. And I think that there were so many places, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but there were so many places in this system of justice where justice did not happen. And it started with the orchestration of these confessions by the police. It went to a prosecutor. Well, first somebody else in the police department should have reviewed it higher up and looked at these statements and thought perhaps there was a little bit of a problem with the inconsistencies, you think? And then it goes to the prosecutor who should be making the same call. None of that happened. And then when I kept thinking, well, they must not have had DNA evidence. There was no DNA evidence. And then when the DNA evidence came back, and it didn't connect to any of them, at that point, you don't have a case anymore. I'm sorry. Roll up the carpet. You made a mistake. Stop. And instead, they just rolled forward. And it was just an incredible breakdown of the justice system. And it's really, really hard to watch as a lawyer.
Do we go with Fairley and Lederer were in the civil suit, since we didn't see all of it you had? Were Lederer and Fairley in the civil suit?
The prosecutors?
Yes.
I believe the prosecutors are named in the civil suit, yes.
Thank you.
Did you say you saw the entire movie?
Yes, I did.
Was this a jury trial?
Yes, it was. And there was, that's another piece of it that you missed. There was one juror who did not believe what was going on. He was holding out for a not guilty. They deliberated for 10 days, I think. And this one guy was holding out for a not guilty based on the inconsistency of the statements. And he said people were yelling at him, throwing things at him, and got to the point where he thought he was going to be physically attacked, and he finally just rolled over and gave up. So even at the jury level, the thing did not work as it should have.
Where was the defense in all this stuff? How come they, if they had the same information, how come they weren't pushing that in the judge's face?
What was...
Or whoever was responsible.
Right. So...
Or one of those
Right.
Or one of those meetings behind closed doors when they're not so polite.
Right. So one of the things that also happened here is these are families that were relatively low-income families without a lot of resources. And I don't know why they were not appointed public defenders, but at least 3 of these boys' families went out and hired lawyers who had no criminal justice experience. The one lawyer that was talking on the film, the guy with the beard, he had some criminal justice experience, but apparently, something I was watching later, one of the boys, I think it was Antron, talked to William Kunstler after the convictions, and William Kunstler said no one could have gotten these boys off. The train was rolling forward, and it wasn't going to stop.
By the way, the defense attorneys all pick different strategies, as any group of defense attorneys would. But I think 4 out of the 5 challenged the propriety of the defendant's confessions. Does anybody think that the New York Court of Appeals did anything with that? I just read the slip decisions. And the answer is no. The New York Court of Appeals said there's nothing wrong with the confessions that the boys tendered. And the decisions are about a page long. And the reason is, I was out trying to get dinner and eat before I came, and I failed, so I missed what you saw. But I saw the whole film, and for purposes of Miranda, if the parents are there, and the parents are there for the Miranda warning, it's great, right? But I don't know how much of this you saw in the film, but it's really like it's like a machine. The police and prosecutorial system is very much like a machine. It's like a stamping machine, and God help you if you get caught up in it. But the parents are there, the defendants are there, they're being read the rights, and it's in a tone and in a setting in which the words don't matter. The message to the defendants is, say yes, say you understand, even if you have no idea what I'm talking about. And I think you see that broadly, that after the Miranda ruling, that confessions never really changed. Defendants still confess, even to crimes they didn't commit. From the ACLU's perspective, there's just a million things to talk about with this film, but I guess because a lot of our work these days has been about accountability, I think Vermonters should really take a hard look at whether police and prosecutorial agencies in Vermont are able to police themselves. At present, many members of the public labor under the incorrect impression that somehow the State Attorney General's office rides herd on police in Vermont and is capable of disciplining them. The answer to that is no. There is no independent oversight agency for the police in Vermont, state or local. The best that anyone can do is to bring a criminal charge against a police officer who misbehaves. And most police misconduct doesn't rise to the level of criminality, right? Those guys, spat in the boys' face. They smoked in their faces, right? None of those are criminal acts. But they are things that are worthy of punishment and, professional sanction. Nonetheless, that doesn't exist here in Vermont.
They coerced them,
Right.
and that is criminal.
Coerce? Well, no, it's not. No, I can put you in a room and yell at you. There's no criminal act there. Right, so in terms of the criminal law, were they permitted to hold?
For that long period of time?
Yeah, they were permitted to hold them, they're permitted to book them, they're permitted to interrogate them, all that stuff. None of that violates the criminal law. But I think we would all recognize what happened as something that's deserving of professional misconduct. Correction, for instance, being fired, being demoted, anything like that. Civil suits are great, and we do a lot of them, but here's something else you might not realize. The prosecutors under federal civil rights law enjoy absolute immunity for acts that are undertaken in their prosecutorial capacity. So the prosecutor's decision to move this case forward, take it to a jury, and send these guys to prison is off limits. Yes, the 4 guys sued a number of people, including the prosecutors. Prosecutors are out for their prosecutorial acts. There's a variety of ways in which you can pull them back in for things they did outside of their prosecutorial role, like when they were acting as investigators. There was a small piece of film beginning in which the prosecutor was on the crime scene, directing the cops where to look. They don't do that anymore because that's a great way to get yourself sued as a prosecutor. So I think people would be somewhat surprised to learn that the methods of correcting this kind of thing in the future are, at least here in Vermont, are somewhat limited. The ACLU continues to believe, though, that the best weapon the police have is the trust of the community. And so, if things are in balance and the community is aware of what the police is doing, there's complete transparency, then you have a situation in which no one's afraid to go to the police, not a victim, especially not a witness. Many times, you run into police departments that are not well liked in the community, and people say, I saw something, I don't want to get involved, I'm not going to say anything. That's kind of the most diseased part of, I think, what we saw in the film, is that you would be out of your mind to get anywhere near the police department in New York City in 1989, right? You just, I don't know if you saw the portion where Corey Wise gets home, he gets to his apartment, there are police officers outside, and they tell him, just come with us, and he says, I got home 13 years later. I mean, so just break your heart. And so for us, one of the ways of trying to make sure something like this never happens in Vermont is to make sure that there are robust ways of keeping police officers and prosecutors in line. Part of that happened this week with a change to our public records law that allows access to criminal investigatory records that used to be off limits. I think that's going to make a huge difference. But we're still working on it.
You mentioned before that victims of sexual abuse crimes have to go through a process of interrogation themselves. That's not true of victims of other kinds of crimes, is it?
Victims of sexual assault have to go through the process of giving a statement, which can go for several hours, and then if they can be brought back in to be questioned if the investigating officer feels like there's not enough evidence, or has talked to someone who maybe is offering a different type of statement about what they saw, didn't see. There's a whole process. So a victim doesn't just go say this happened and then they're free to go home.
But isn't that the same with victims of any type of crime?
I can't answer.
I see. Okay.
I think generally speaking, you'll find the same thing. I will not identify the person. There's a fabulous former prosecutor and criminal practitioner in the room. But my suspicion, I do civil cases, but as an attorney, you never want to move your case forward without knowing precisely what the story is. And if the person, there's an old saying amongst attorneys, not in Vermont, and invariably, which is, never trust nobody who told you nothing. So I don't care, if it's the most clear-cut thing and it's on tape and you're telling me that the cops violated your rights, I'm going to look into it. I have an ethical duty to do it, and I'm going to grill you about it because the other side is going to do way worse than I will. So I think you'll find that's reasonably consistent.
I have not seen the whole film, so there was a sequence where they were doing the timeline, and were the boys all placed in those locations where they said, they ended up near the reservoir at, I don't remember, 9:30, something like that, whatever. How did they do that? Did the boys admit to that also?
I don't know if it was directly addressed. I'm given to understand. I inferred from watching the movie that they did, because they all freely said, oh yeah, I was hassling the old guy and I was throwing rocks at the guy on the bike. And part of that is what makes the case alluring to a jury, right? Because you got these guys saying, oh yeah, I was, chucking rocks at joggers. It's like, who does that,
So in other words, it was your understanding that they were just hassling these people, they didn't harm them. They were just harassing them, but they didn't physically assault any of the other people.
My recollection was that most of them denied having anything directly to do. It was they met up with a group of young men who numbered somewhere around 20, who were going through the park doing those things, and most of these guys, at least when they were being interviewed, were saying, I didn't participate in that, I watched it, and I was 14 years old, and I couldn't even understand why these other guys were doing this to other people. It was fascinating to me on a weird level, because I'm 14 years old, and so I'm watching this happen, and I don't really understand why it's happening. So they denied, I think, having actually done any of the other crimes, but I think they admitted to it when they were, as part of their confessions, they admitted to
And
something.
in the movie, at any time, did Koch not recant? I don't expect him ever to do that, but did he offer some sense of his own culpability about this, or did he die before? I don't know.
He didn't in the movie, but one that brings up one thing that struck me and that always strikes me in my work is that people should pay attention to the way in which their government reacts to accusations that it has misbehaved. So the civil suit was filed in 2003, very shortly after these 5 guys were released from prison. It continues to go today. The city has fought it tooth and nail, scorched earth. This very film engendered ancillary litigation over whether the city and its defense could discover all of the raw tape and the outtakes for the purpose of defending itself against a civil suit. There's no quarter. The city has given not an inch of ground in defending what its people did, notwithstanding what you saw. And in Vermont, I get very frustrated when the public doesn't have the opportunity to see a lot of this litigation, but when public officials are out there vigorously defending just god-awful things in a really aggressive way, and you sort of want to stop and say, you know, I hope the voters figure this out at some point, right? I mean, the police department in New York pays out huge amounts of money for a very aggressive police force that it uses very aggressive tactics, and yet there's, you know, as the historian said, there's this kind of dichotomy. We're outraged about what happened, and we could care less about the back end. Are these guys ever going to get justice? Is anyone ever going to get fired for what happened?
But there's a major undertone here that needs to be discussed, and that is something that I was out recently on the West Coast, and I saw this resurface recently. It was the same thing that happened in Boston several years ago. There was an article in the Boston Globe that talked about the fact that crime has never been lower in this country, especially handgun crime. And it makes sense because we've pumped a ton of money into Homeland Security, and we've got more security cameras, we've armed police to the teeth. And even though crime is low, the perception of crime is very high. And so every time there is a crime, what we do is we ask our legislators to pass things like mandatory sentencing. And we ask them to pass more and more laws, which only give the police more reasons to stop people, more reasons to hassle people. And as you well pointed out, we don't have the transparency. We allow the police to investigate themselves. And part of the problem that's brought out in this movie is exactly that. It's fear. People were pressured to get confessions, and the police were pressured to make a conviction, to make an arrest in this crime. People are pressured to make a conviction, and people are pressured to get stories out and to even fight this civil lawsuit. And a lot of that is fear-based. When the fear is high in the public, because these things get reported in the way they do, this is where those people feel pressured to take action. And they're doing this in our name. And so we're sort of individually, as a society, we're very divided by this. And I think that's something we all have to look inside ourselves about.
Can I ask, I obviously haven't seen the whole movie, and maybe they addressed it in the part that we skipped, but why does this guy 13 years later come forward and decide that he's going to now confess to the crime? That doesn't, if it was there, we skipped it. So I'm just wondering, you know, was there some sort of reason that he decided to come forward 13 years later?
He was incarcerated in the same facility with Corey Wise, who was the young man who served the longest sentence. And he ran into Corey somewhere in the prison and realized that he was the guy who was doing time for a crime that Mateus Reyes committed. And he felt terrible, and he went back and said he wanted to confess.
This guy had a conscience?
Well, but it's really interesting because apparently there was an undercurrent of the two of them had beef. They had been 10 years earlier incarcerated at Rikers, and they had a fight in the TV room. 10 years later, this guy sees Corey Wise at a different facility and says, I'm sorry that we got in a fight over the TV. And Corey Wise says, I mean, he just seems such a gentle soul. He says, don't worry about it. That, it's nothing to me, man. I'm serving time for it. And he talks about the crime, right? And there is at least this, I found this very slight hint that if Corey Wise had said, come at me again and I'll kill you, or something different, the guy would have never opened his mouth. I mean, it's just like Cleopatra's nose version of history.
As attorneys, what do you do when the case gets that, when you're in maybe towards in the third quarter or the half through the case where there's already been confessions and things like that, and on a civil rights case and it's that bad, what would you do in the case of Vermont? In the public's eye or the case, or as an attorney, or what?
I'm sorry, in what role? As a prosecutor or?
As an attorney, as a defense attorney, I guess, what would you do? Is there anything to do?
Well, I don't know if they showed it in the segment, but the interest, I mean, again, this gets into so many things that were interesting about this film, but there was a point at which defense counsel, as it should have, spoke to their clients about a plea agreement, right? Resolving the case with a plea agreement. And that is so common that the criminal justice system almost never has trials. In Vermont, 2 years ago, statewide, there were 7 felony trials in the whole state. Way more than 99, I would say something like 97 out of 100 cases in Vermont result in pleas. And you can see the real, awful tension that these guys faced, where as lawyers, or as anybody who's sort of seen the system up close, you would say, look, that you got a good deal here. You could get out in, a couple of years and just go about your life. And on the other hand, these guys all decided, forget it, I'm going to fight it, I'm going to go all the way. This case was, in some senses, even though it was awful to watch, it had much less potential for cruelty than a lot of adult cases in Vermont, because most of them were charged as juveniles. So you see the sentence they got was like 5 to 10 years. I mean, in Vermont, they'd be facing, as adults, they'd be facing life. And a huge range, right? So the roll of the dice when you're talking to the client about what could happen in this case, it's like, well, you could get 2 years, you could get your whole life. Who knows? So I think that the short answer is that I'm not a criminal practitioner, but I would expect that you absolutely have an ethical duty to convey an offer to your client if you get one. I'm sure the prosecution made one in this case because they talked about it. And then there is some kind of hard math. Anyone who's done criminal law knows you really have to sit there and your client has to think about it. And these guys all spoke very eloquently about they decided, I'm going to eat it. If I have to go down, I'll go down, and that's it. And that's noble, but they're lucky it worked out. Because there are huge knock-on consequences for a criminal conviction. Housing, the ability to get federal student loans, the ability to get employment, all that stuff that the client, perhaps deportation, depending on their status. So for somebody weighing an offer, there's a lot more on the table than just prison time, as if prison itself is not enough of a threat.
I have a question about the sort of the tone of the interrogation. So I would welcome a response from anybody on the panel about this, because it came up in the film, and also I can't remember which one of you brought up the tone, sort of made it almost inevitable that those young men, that those boys would have, confessed to something they had not done. So I'm curious, what would a different scenario look like for interrogation that would not produce that type of intimidating tone, that would still also be effective to get a confession out of a person who had committed the crime? What would you recommend be done differently?
I'm glad that we had some discussion about the Innocence Protection Act, because our kind of preferred solution has less to do with tone and more to do with video recording. I would love for interrogations to be recorded. The police are dead set against it because there would be rioting in the streets if you saw a lot of police interrogations. In other words, there is some coercion to it. But, if it were recorded, you could look back on it and say, well, here's what actually happened. They backed him into a corner and they were spitting in his face and all that kind of stuff. Ideally, if should you find yourself on the receiving end of, criminal interrogation, the answer is don't say anything. You can take whatever tone they want. Don't say a thing.
And ask for a lawyer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the other thing that's striking about this is these were children, you know, and that's because you're watching them, they're adults when they're talking to you in this film. You almost forget that these were little boys. They had never had any contact with the criminal justice system. They had no idea about criminal justice rights or asking for a lawyer. They had none of that, and the police used that. And they used their minority to manipulate them.
I forget which one, but one of the boys, when has a Coke or a Pepsi given to him, and you're listening to his answers, and it sounds like here is a kid who would have said, you know, are you a Martian? Yes, ma'am, I am. I mean, he was just giving yes, yes, yes all the way through.
And he was the same kid that, I don't know if other people noticed, but when they gave him a photo of the jogger, kind of did a...
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
What is
And
it?
that was just...
Have you been there? You said, oh, yeah, sure.
But isn't it required now that, I mean, can the police actually interrogate a minor without someone being there from child services or from, I mean...
No, it's the parent or the guardian typically, and I think that one of the most insidious things you saw, or not insidious, but you know, my parents are reasonably strict, nothing crazy, but I think it was Antron's father was there and sort of took the attitude like, you tell them everything, you know, you tell them what you did.
Right.
You know, and so if the parent consents, that's the ballgame. The other thing we should say about this sort of systematizing of confessions and interrogations is that the same perils happen for the complaining witness, you know, who comes in and says, this happened to me, right? The police, we don't want the police to look at a man and say, get in their heads immediately, I know what happened to you, or look at a woman and say, I know how this assault happened, right? You know, there are many different forms of sexual violence, and that we should be similarly cautious about the police talking to a victim who is going to be, you know, obviously not, I'm going to imagine, not eager to talk about this in a police station, and sort of pushing, you know, providing detail, providing a theory about how this happened, rather than listening to the victim and saying, what happened here?
And oftentimes that happens up at the emergency room, and if there is a parent there, and at times it can be a father, the police will talk with that teenage victim with those parents present and ask that teenager to talk about everything that took place. So imagine if your parent that's there is your father and you're a teenager and now you have to talk about every detail of what happened to you. And it's the same with if the victim has gone out and had a drink. And I'm not the alcohol police, so I don't care if the victim is 18 and had a drink or if they're 22 and had a drink. But it's the same, you know, they're answerable to, well, you were drinking, you know, so it is right that it happens for everyone, that we need to be mindful of how that goes down.
When was DNA allowed in court to be as evidence? What year was it?
Probably, I mean, I would imagine the first challenges to it as scientific evidence would have been like in the 80s.
And what was the ruling in the paper today by the Supreme Court? They can take it before they're accused, or they can't take it?
That's Maryland versus King, which came down a couple of days ago, and the question was under it's a little more technical than just sort of can you take DNA. So it's can you take DNA from an arrestee, so someone who has been arrested but not tried or convicted of the crime at the time of booking and without a warrant. None of that was in play in this situation. There were no challenges to the taking of the DNA, and the DNA that was taken from the defendants all had to do with the crime that they had been accused of. The sort of modern DNA screening system has been built around running arrestees past a list of unsolved crimes and trying to determine whether or not the person who happens to have been arrested for X also did Y. And that engenders many, many constitutional problems That's what Maryland versus King dealt with.
Has there been a ruling on that hearing yet?
Yeah.
So what is it, that they can take the DNA on arrest? Or? Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, the court ruled that for purposes of the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, warrantless, unconsented DNA searches are fine. They said for serious crimes. I mean, there's kind of a ton of problems with the ruling, but we don't know what serious crimes mean. The Vermont Supreme Court has before it right now the question of whether warrantless arrestee DNA collection is okay under Article 11 of the Vermont Constitution, which has in many instances been found to be more protective of individual rights. So the question under state law will be settled, we expect, by next spring.
Well, if there are any more questions, if we could just have final comments about each of you, and then we'll...
Well, I found all of the stuff that you folks said very interesting, so thank you very much. I appreciate hearing what you had to say.
And I guess my final comment would be that we've all taken this time to watch something that was very painful for everybody to watch, including the victims involved in this case, and that we can only continue to question, ask, and hopefully ensure the rights of every human being so that this does not happen again.
I just wanted to finish up. I was looking at the Scottsboro boys case today just to kind of refresh my recollection. And this is a statement that a guy named Douglas O'Linder wrote, kind of summing up. He did a whole summary of it, but he said, "The story of the Scottsboro boys is one of the most shameful examples of injustice in our nation's history. It makes clear that in the Deep South of the 1930s, jurors were not willing to accord a black charged with raping a white woman the usual presumption of innocence. In fact, one may argue that the presumption seemed reversed. A black was presumed guilty unless he could establish his innocence beyond a reasonable doubt." Hannah Arendt wrote of the banality of evil. "Evil rarely comes in the form of monsters, but rather in the form of relatively normal people who, for reasons of careers, ideology, or a desire for society's approval, are indifferent to the human consequences of their actions. Because of indifferent jurors and career-motive prosecutors, the self-serving and groundless accusations of a single woman were allowed to change forever the lives of 9 black teenagers who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time." Scottsboro Boys, 1930s. Central Park 5, 1989.
And many more today. So.
And many more today.
That's
And I just want to thank the library for putting this together. I think this was amazingly thought-provoking, and it gave me, I had heard about this film, but hadn't had the sort of excuse to watch it and to think about it. So thank you to the library for doing this.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.